Welcome to the third session of FHIR Basics by FHIR India Community. And today we will be discussing about FHIR Resources. We'll try to understand what are FHIR Resources and how do we use them. Okay. So before we get started, this slide is not completely mine. And this slide actually borrows from the work that has been done by the FHIR community, international FHIR community. So the credit goes to them. All right. So what's the agenda for today? Today's agenda, we will start with a recap of the previous session as right, and if there are any questions. Then actually, if time permits, we have a couple of exercises, and then there is a pre-work for next session. So now from today, we are actually entering the business end of the sessions. So till now, it was all more of a theory, more of understanding what it is and why it is. Now, slowly we are getting into where we actually start talking about the practical aspects of FHIR, right? So the pre-work for the next session will be helpful in grasping the next session well. So before we start, an introduction to FHIR India Community to whoever is new. So FHIR India Community is a community of FHIR interoperability enthusiasts. It is a community of developers, business analysts, doctors, clinicians, healthcare administrators, policy guys. So it's a diverse community. If you join that community and the members of that community enjoy a wide variety of discussions and wide variety of work areas where they can contribute and learn. If you want to tag FHIR India Community, you can use the hashtag FHIR India, and then the discussion forum and LinkedIn group you are already aware of. Okay, with that, we get on to the session. We start the session. So starting the session, we start with a recap. So far, what we have learned is session 1 was about introduction to interoperability and introduction to the basic principles of FHIR, right? The second session was more about understanding the APIs, the FHIR APIs. What are the RESTful APIs? What are the paradigms? And what is RESTful? How do you do searches? What are the CRUD operations available? So these were the things in session 2. Okay. So the highlights were, the first is we understood what is FHIR. So FHIR is an acronym for new standard, which is Fast Healthcare Interoperability Resources. And in that, the last R we are going to discuss today. It's a new standard from HL7.org. It is in version 4. So the version of FHIR that we are going to work with, and which is the latest version, is R4. As in the name, in the acronym itself, right? So Fast Health Interoperability Resources. So resources are the basic building blocks. So resources are the focus or are the core of FHIR as a standard. So today, that's why it's an important session where we are going to understand the resources, right? What are resources, right? And why they are important. Okay. Now, so resources you can understand as what? What is the data? I mean, so the data itself is the resources. You can think of that, right? So like a patient or whatever data you want to exchange, right? The patient observation, diagnosis of a patient or a lab result, all those things are what, right? And those are resources. And then you can exchange those resources or send and receive those resources and do various operations on those resources by multiple paradigms that FHIR supports. So the 4 FHIR paradigms are RESTful APIs that we discussed in the last session, messaging, documents and services. Okay. And then for the full spec, you can just go to hl7.org/FHIR to understand what it is. We are not going to discuss messaging services and documents much in the sessions that we have. We have already discussed about the RESTful APIs, and today we are going to discuss about resources. In due course of time, if there is context and if there are questions, we will touch base on the other paradigms of FHIR. Okay. We looked at the FHIR RESTful paradigm last week. So it's based on REST. It has the basic concept of resources where all your data is represented as resources. The resources are URI addressable, means each of the resource has a definite identifier and a location where you can access them. FHIR uses HTTP methods to do CRUD operations. HTTP methods like post, put, get, and delete. So these are the post operations typically that FHIR uses, but it also supports the patch operation and some other operations. We'll see that. So yeah, the fifth one is FHIR actually extends the HTTP methods for additional base operations. Like for example, if we have to, and this we saw in the last session, if we had to get everything for a patient, right? So there was an operation called $everything. Similarly, if you have to validate a data set, validate a code, or validate a structure definition, right? There is a $validate operation. So there are different operations which fall a little bit outside of the basic CRUD operations. So FHIR supports them as well. Okay, and resources can be exchanged over the wire in different formats. So you can use either XML or JSON, which are the most prevalent, most predominantly used. You can also use the Turtle RDF format, and NDJSON right now is being used for bulk exchange of FHIR. So FHIR follows the REST standard or the REST paradigm loosely, and that's why it is safe to call RESTful paradigm instead of a REST. So that's about the RESTful paradigm. So we also looked at FHIR services, and we said we saw that there are 3 levels at which FHIR services operate. One is at the instance level. Instance level is at one particular instance of the resource. For example, patient whose ID is Satyam, right? So at instance level, at individual resource level, at a type level means at a resource type level. So for at patient level, at at this level itself. For example, if you want the capability statement or what does this FHIR server support, right? So that's a system level operation or system level service, right? Similarly, if you, and we saw in the last session also, if we have to do a batch transaction, right? That is also a system level service. So FHIR supports services at 3 levels. Okay. And the last thing that we touched in the session last week was about the capability statement. So we saw about the RESTful paradigms, and we saw about so many APIs, so many types, and so many such parameters. And then the logical question was, do we need to implement everything? And how do we know if the FHIR server supports, what does the FHIR server support, right? So capability statement comes in handy, and this is one of the services that each and every FHIR server needs to support, right? So FHIR servers must support a capability statement generation service, right? What it does is it tells what does your FHIR server or the client support, right? So that's the basic intent of a capability statement. So it actually tells you about the version, what are the resources it supports, the search parameters, the formats it supports, whether it is a client or a server, also the developer information, and all those different information or blocks of data that you would need when you are dealing with a production server. So those all information is available as part of a capability statement, and capability statement in itself is a resource also. Okay. So, and this is on the right hand side, you see this is how you get the capability statement. You just go to the FHIR server base and just do metadata. Rest everything is optional. You want to keep it, you do it. Otherwise, just metadata and you get the capability statement. More information about the capability statement, you can get to the spec, which is mentioned below. All right. So we can take a couple of questions if there are any on the previous sessions. And if there are none questions, then we can move on to FHIR Resources. So I'll take a 1 minute pause. If you have questions, please let me know.
No questions right now, Satyam, but if the questions from the last session, someone wants to take, we missed a few from Shreyas, Selvakumar, Baburao, Madhura, Rajesh. If they are present, they can ask their questions again from the last session.
Okay. So anyways, I think you can ask the questions anytime you want. So with that, we get into FHIR Resources. So the name itself, the FHIR, the standard itself talks about resources. So resources become a critical part of the FHIR spec. Resources are actually the data, deal with the data. What exactly are you going to exchange? So those are the resources, right? Yesterday or the last week, we saw we can do a lot of operations, search, create, delete, update. But on what we were doing those operations? We were doing those operations on resources, right? So today we are going to see what are these resources and why these are important. Okay. So FHIR Resources. So what are resources? So resources are actually the smallest unit of transaction in the FHIR world, right? They have a defined meaning and a behavior, and they have an identity. And in the RESTful world, they have a location, right? So on the server where you can find a particular resource or a particular instance of a resource, right? So that's what a resource is. Okay, and this is the formal definition, the second paragraph that we got from the FHIR spec. It says that it is a known entity. It has a known identity. What it means, it has a presence on, it's addressable on the web or it's addressable on the server. So it has a URL, right? And then it has a type, and the type is one of the defined types in the FHIR spec. It contains structured data items, and it is identified with versions as well, right? So that's what FHIR resources are. So in short. So now to check our understanding with, did we understand FHIR resources or not? Let's have a quiz. Okay. So examples. So first we will look at some examples of FHIR resources. So patient practitioner organizations. So these are all FHIR resources because these are entities which are of importance in healthcare, and they can be operated standalone on their own, right? And they, we saw in the last session also that we actually did some operations on the patient. So they fulfill the definition of a resource. Similarly, location coverage invoice fulfill the definition of a resource. And then we had a lot of clinical things because in healthcare, you're dealing with a lot of clinical and a lot of medical stuff. So for example, allergic intolerance, condition, family history, care plan, everything of such is a FHIR resource. So what is a FHIR resource? A FHIR resource is a logical entity which is self-contained and which can be operated on its own, right? So that's the basic definition of FHIR resource as I see. And if you add to it more specifics, the FHIR resources are actually identified on the FHIR server by the type, and the instances are actually available on the server after the type as an ID. So if you want to access patient with an ID 1, you will be the base server /patient/1, and that's the addressable identifier of the resource. Okay, so things to note: these are units which are sufficiently well defined, and their boundaries are well defined, where they can be operated fairly in a standalone manner, and they in themselves fulfill certain requirement of the healthcare. So that's where we should think of resources as, because, and bundles, binary, and compositions are also resources, because if we go to non-examples, for example, gender, right? Gender is also an important thing. Gender is actually in healthcare a very important thing, right? So we need to know the gender of a patient, right? But does it qualify as a resource? No. Why? Because it's too small, because it just conveys gender, but gender of whom? So we need, in order to make any tangible or any meaningful operation or any meaningful exchange, we need to know more than just the gender value. We might need to know the name of the patient, maybe address, date of birth, and something like that, right? So gender in itself does not qualify as a resource because it's too small. Now, okay, if gender is too small, what about electronic health record? So what happens with electronic health record is too vast. Like it encompasses everything, right? So, and as we say, the definition of a resource is a resource can be operated fairly in a standalone manner, and they can be addressable on the server, right? So electronic health record becomes a little bit too big, right? Because it actually consists of a lot of things which can in themselves be resources, right? And examples would be patient demographics, encounter, observations, discharge summary. All those things can actually be clubbed into electronic health records. So electronic health record also does not qualify as a resource. Okay. So if gender is too small, electronic health record is too big, then what about blood pressure? So blood pressure in itself is very narrow, right? So blood pressure is a very narrow definition, and that's why it does not qualify as a resource. It's too specific, right? It's just blood pressure, right? And if you see, even if you capture vital signs, blood pressure, you have to actually provide a lot more information, right? So these are just non-examples that I put so that you are clear of what are resources. So now you know a patient is a resource, but gender is not a resource. A discharge or a diagnostic report is a resource, but electronic health record is not a report, not a resource. Observations is a resource, but blood pressure is not a resource. Okay. Now, and this example we saw in the first session also. It is an example of a resource, a typical example of a resource, and we'll get deeper into what is a resource. But whenever you see a FHIR resource, what you need to know is like it has few sections and few logical organization, right? The first thing on the top is always the resource identity, the ID of the resource. If you see the first line itself after the patient acceptance is the ID, the value, like the identity of the resource, okay? And then it is followed by the metadata, okay? And we'll see what metadata contains. So the first part of a resource is always identity and the metadata. And these things are important because when we are going to operate or when we are going to work with resources, these things will come in handy. So pay attention. Okay. The next part of a resource is actually the narrative. Okay. And the narrative is actually the human readable XHTML form where the data is described, which can be read by a human. Okay. If you see here, it's under text tag, and it actually talks about that the name would be Henry this and MRN is this, and if you see it's in P tag, okay. And then if there are any extensions and all, and extensions, you might remember that extensions are required in case where the base FHIR standard or the base FHIR resources do not fulfill the specific needs of the domain that you are working on. And so you will be using some kind of extensions. Right? So if there are extensions, then the extensions come then. And after that, actually the resource data comes in the structured form. Right? So this is at a very high level, a structure of any resources that you will come up to, right? And just remember that a lot of these things are actually optional, right? So do not expect that everything should be present in all the resources, okay? Because everything can be optional. A blank resource is also a valid resource in FHIR. So just keep that in mind. Okay. But if there is a resource, these are the things that you should be expecting to see. Okay. Okay. So what we can do now is actually, instead of talking, we can actually go and see some resources and take a closer look at the resources and then come back to the session. Okay. So I hope everyone is on a device where you can browse with me, right? So it could be a laptop, it could be mobile or anything, right? So just go to, and I can give you this, copy, chat, paste. So let's go to the resource list. So we go here. So I'll start from the base so that even if you don't have the URLs, you know how to reach to FHIR. So you go to hl7.org and you just do /FHIR. You come to the base specification page. All right. And then here, you actually click on resources. And this is the resource list, that the URL that I gave. Okay. With me. So far, you're following?
Yes, sir.
Yes, Satyam.
Okay. Good. So now in this page, the resource list, you see the resources are listed in here, but they are listed in different categories, right? So if you see, there is a category listing here, then there is an alphabetical listing, there is an R2 layout, there is by maturity, by security, by standard status, by committees. So many ways the same resource can be actually presented depending on how do you want to see the resources. Okay. So what we need to see is, so since we are at here, we'll just look at this categorized list. So the categories are foundation. So what the resources that are listed in here in the first category are, the FHIR says that these are foundational resources. Then there are base resources, then clinical resources, financial resources, specialized resources. Okay. And you see some numbers in front of all the resources, right? So like capability statement has N, implementation guide has 1, search parameter has 3, terminology capabilities has 0, right? So many numbers, right? So when we are looking at the resources, we should see the name and also the number. What does this suffix say? Let's go by maturity. So actually this suffix indicates the maturity of the resource. So if you go here, what is the same resources are now listed in terms of maturity. Okay. So as we saw in session 1, that the maturity level of FHIR starts from level 0 and it goes up till normative standard or normative level, right? So 0 is something that is in very nascent stage, like it's still in the draft stage, or it's just like the build is succeeding, or the resource in itself is defined, but there is no guarantee that this resource will work in the real world, right? Level 1 again is a little better, and there is actually the FHIR maturity model that we talked again in session 1 that you should be looking at when you are looking at the levels of resources. But the general rule of thumb is always go with the highest level. If a resource is listed at the highest level, it has the best of maturity, and by maturity we mean that there will be less and less of breaking changes, right? And there will be compatibility going forward, right? So the concept of breaking change is like you don't have to do some drastic rework, right? So if you are going to resources which are in lower maturity, then there is no guarantee that the next release of FHIR will actually not break your implementation, right? But if you are at you're implementing resources which are at a maturity level higher, like 3, 4, and 5, and N, then actually you can be certain that the breaking changes will be less, And if the level 5 and N is there, means there will be always forward compatibility maintained. Okay. So now you understood. So today, FHIR standard is so what is the status of FHIR standard? If somebody asks you, so the status of FHIR standard is mixed normative, right? What does mixed normative say is that the contents have normative. Normative is like it's a standard, it's a released and you can say stable release, but it is mixed, means there are a lot of other things which are not yet not at normative, they are still in a draft stage or in different levels of maturity. So the FHIR standard version R or version R4 is actually mixed normative. Okay. So understood that. And these are the resources which are actually normative, which are actually stable and released. So forward compatibility for these resources will be maintained in the next versions, right? Level 4 and level 3, we expect lesser changes, but changes are expected. Changes may be expected. So just when you're implementing, be cautious of that. Okay. We saw that patient actually is N. N means a normative content. So patient is a stable resource. So we know that going forward, the changes in patient will not break our implementation. Okay. So now let's take a look into the patient resource. So click on patient resource. Okay. So you actually go to, yes, I can't see the header, just a minute. Okay. So you actually go to the resource page. Okay. So the resource page is actually listed as FHIR / the resource type and .html. Okay. So we are in the patient, you can just change it to say encounter practitioner and you can just go in there. Okay. So how do we read this? So the FHIR spec or the resource specs defines, first if you see here on the top, you have various groupings, right? So patient administration is the work group. So in HL7 org, there is a concept of project groups who are working on certain aspects, right? So, and they are called work groups. So there are various work groups and patient administration is one of the work groups which is actually responsible for the patient resource. Then the maturity level, and then the security category is patient. So when we look at the security categories in the final session, we'll talk about what is the security category and how does it impact you. Okay. And compartments are actually, again, good or used for different operations and searches that we, if time permits, we will see them. But right now, you can see compartments as, again, a grouping of resources together so that some kind of related operations can be performed. Okay. Now, before we go there, we see there is a tab for content. There is a tab for examples. So FHIR spec, every resource, every element should have examples. So if you see here, you have tons of examples of a patient resource, right? So if you want to play with a patient resource, you have to come to the patient and then you click on examples and you see a lot of resources. You can download the resources in whatever format you want to work on. It can be XML, JSON, and Turtle right now that is supported, right? Then it also supports detailed descriptions, whereas you will see the details of each and every field. Mappings. Mappings are like, so if there is a resource, what would be its equivalent in, say, version 2 of HL7 or in version 3 of HL7, right? So that indicative mapping is done here, right? Even different standards, right? But keep in mind, this is just a guiding mapping, right? So don't take it as the mapping, right? So this may be not the exact that you would want, right? Then every resource, if there are some profiles and extensions that are applicable, that will be listed here. What are the operations that this resource support will be listed in operations. For example, remember we did $everything. So $everything is actually listed as an supported operation for patient. Okay. And R3 conversion is just for tooling. Like how can you convert an R3 version FHIR R3 resource into FHIR R4 resource, right? So the mappings are given here. So if you have an R3 resource and you want to convert it into R4, actually the translation tables are given here. You just have to just code for it. Okay, so that's how you start with the patient resource. So what we will be looking at is the content piece today and some examples. Okay, so the first thing that the resource defines is like, what is this resource? What is the scope and the usage of the resource? And then actually the description of the resource, the content of the resource. Okay, with me, following so far? Any questions? All right. So it's very important that you should read, or so whenever you are trying to implement and you want to find out which resource is applicable or which resource you want to use, right? The thing that you need to do is actually, if you have an idea of that resource, just go to the resource page and look at the scope and usage. Also, in combination with the resource content, so that to figure out whether this resource is applicable to you or makes sense for you in your particular use case, right? Do that. Okay. And then actually is the structure of the resource, right? So if you see here, patient resource is a type of a domain resource, okay? And then it has identifiers, then a lot of different attributes, okay? A lot of different attributes. We'll go to the attributes one by one, but first let's understand this structure. So name of the attributes, I think there is no problem, so everyone understands the names. The second is the flag. The flags are a little bit, what I say is flag you should be understanding and you should remember the flags. Some of the flags are important because they change the meaning of the entire resource, right? So just keep an eye on the flags. Cardinality is about whether that attribute, what is the, like whether that attribute is optional, mandatory, or repeatable or not, right? That's the cardinality. And then the type is the data type of the resource and then a description, okay? Now, I talked about this flags, right? So N is for normative, that we understand. This sigma is important. It's actually the summary flag. So whenever you are implementing a FHIR server, right? This, wherever is the sigma, this sign, right? This should actually be included in your narrative. So whenever you're generating the XHTML piece of the resource, you should include the value from the attribute which is mentioned as sigma. Okay. Now you see this question mark and exclamation. This is actually very important, and every implementer should pay attention to this. What it means is it's a modifier. And what is a modifier? A modifier is something which the value of which can actually change the meaning of the entire resource. Okay. So if you see active is actually a modifier. Why? Because if patient is, and it's a Boolean. Boolean means it's a true or false. So if the patient is inactive or false, then you don't need to worry about this resource. So anything else is of no use to you, right? But only if the patient is active, you will go through and do certain things. So that's why the flags, which are actually modifiers, are very important from the implementation point of view. If you are a clinical modeler, if you're a business analyst, if you are a clinician, do pay attention to the modifier flags. So you see, there is a modifier flag in active. There is a modifier flag in diseased also. Now, why there is a modifier flag in diseased? Because again, if a patient is diseased, your entire workflow changes, right? Versus a patient who is not diseased. So that's why it's a modifier here also, right? One special thing to note here is that there is an X. So not everywhere there is an X. Here is an X, here is an X. Anywhere else there is an X? No. So wherever there is an X in a resource, what it means is, it means actually there is a choice, right? So what it means is, you can't say a patient who is dead that he's dead and his death time is this. No, you have to do a choice. You have to do a selection. either you put the Boolean true or false, or you give the disease date and time. So you cannot give both the attributes. That's the choice parameter means, right? So pay attention to that, right? So when you are implementing or whenever you are designing an application, the choice operator is important, because in that case, you can use only one of the several values that are listed. So similarly, in multiple birth, either you can say, yes, there are multiple births, or you can give them in what order the birth happened, right? That's how it is. Okay, so after this description, which actually talks to you about what are the attributes that can be in the patient, and we understood this, you can actually look at the XML, UML, and all the different things. The other thing that you need to know is a concept of references, which is again very important concept in FHIR. So what happens is no resource in itself in health. So, and I think we talked about this in session 1, right? Healthcare is all about communication, right? People communicate with each other, right? And there is an interlinkage everywhere, right? So a resource would be interlinked to multiple different resources, right? To provide meaningful value, right? So here, references are actually a way of linking a resource to the other resource, right? So here what it says is, who is this patient's general practitioner? You just give the general practitioner's reference or the link to that particular resources identifier. So that's all the reference is. Okay, similarly, there is a reference. Where is this patient located, or who is the managing organization? So there is a reference. So that's how, and we'll see a resource now after some time. And then after that, there are terminology bindings. We will look at terminology bindings in the next session. But today, what we need to know is, whenever there is, so for example, gender, you see gender, you can't write transgender as a gender in FHIR. So that's not allowed. You can only choose the gender values from what is given here. And why is it so? Because the value set binding is required. Okay, so we will look at value set binding and the strength of binding in the next session when we are talking about the conformance and the terminologies. But today you should remember that these things that are listed here are very important. Now you want to know about details of any of the attributes and you don't know about it. Just click on that and you actually go ahead to the details of that particular attribute. All right. And then I will pause here, okay, and I'll let every one of you to just explore. And if certain sections do not make sense in this particular page, or if you understand everything, we will move to the next part of the session. Okay, just keep that in mind that at a high level, there is a scope, there is the description of the resource, there is attributes. The attributes actually have a very good language defined. And then the last thing that I would put you is about the search parameters. So every resource, right? What are the search parameters that that are supported by that resource, right? Are actually listed by the spec towards the bottom of that particular particular resource. So what it means is, for a patient, you can actually use these many search parameters, right? So if you are implementing a FHIR server, you can choose how many search parameters or what search parameters that you want to implement for a particular given resource, right? You may choose to actually implement all of these search parameters, or you may choose just saying that for patient, so many searches are not making sense. I will just do a search on patient family name, gender, and say given name. That's also valid. Whatever is the search parameter you implement, you just put it in the capability statement and you're done with it. Now, your question would be, what if a search parameter that I need or I want is not listed in the standard? What would you do in that case? So that's a question for you to think about, and we will answer it towards the end of the session. So now, 5 minutes for everyone. Just go through the resource and see if you understand the basic structure of the resource. And now if you go to a resource, you are able to understand what the resource is. don't get into all these details because these are just details, right? Explanation. All you need to know is the description, the scope, and actually the resource content. And if you want to look at these things, you can just look at it. So it's 4:50, maybe 4:52, 2 minutes. 5 minutes is too much.
Could you please briefly talk about the cardinals?
You mean the cardinality? This one?
Yes, that's right.
Okay. If you hover on that, it says the minimum and the maximum number of times the element can appear in an instance. So what it means is, suppose you are creating, so since we are talking about patient, we are talking about patient and saying that, and take the example of gender, right? So how many times a gender attribute can be in a patient resource, or if you're creating an instance for Satyam, so Satyam as a patient, right? How many times can you mention patient gender in that? It's only either you don't mention the gender, or if you want to mention, you can mention only once. Okay. Whereas telecom, right? 0 to star, you can actually provide n number of telecom information about a particular patient. I mean, I can have a mobile number, I can have a landline number, I can have a pager, I can have so many things, right? So that's what the cardinality says. Cardinality says what is the minimum and what is the maximum that an attribute can repeat.
But that means an identifier also can have multiple?
Yes. So identifier is actually the business identifier, right? So you can have an MRN as an identifier. You can have a social security number as an identifier. In our case, Aadhaar card also becomes an identifier, right? So identifier is actually the business identifier, right? It's not the ID.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah. Identifier is more about the human. So we can have multiple identifiers, right? That's what it is. Okay. It's 52.
Question regarding cardinality and sigma symbol.
Okay. Cardinality I just explained. Is there anything else that I need to speak?
Can you go back to the administrative gender, please?
Administrative gender.
Yeah. Last time there was a question whether we can write the value of M capital, F capital, or they should be as it is.
You can't write. So, and this we will discuss in the terminology in the next session. But wherever you see the required, and just keep that in mind for now, that wherever you see a binding strength as required, right, you can't actually use anything else. Okay. So you have to use male in lowercase, female in lowercase, other and unknown. You can't even have the fifth value, technically. Yeah.
Is there a flexibility or custom thing to add additional gender type? Because we have types like and transgender, male to female, female to male kind of types.
So you can't do in the gender attribute that you can do in extensions. So you'll have to write an extension, create an extension, right? And in that extension, you can define whatever you want to define, right?
So
and,
that,
yeah, go ahead.
That extension also should be there in the compatibility statement?
Yes. Otherwise, how would somebody know that you are supporting an extension, right? So,
okay. Will it be part of gender resource? Because just I'm wondering if we cannot add additional type here, if we are doing it as a extension, and since this is a required field, what we need to fill here?
No. So it's not a required field. It's 0 to 1. The cardinality is 0 to 1, right? So what it means is it can be optional, right? The required here means that if you are putting a value, the value is required to be one of these.
Okay. Got it.
All right. So now let's take an example of how does a FHIR resource patient real, right? So what I did was I just, and I took the JSON value of it, okay? And I'll explain what this tool is and all later. But here, if you see, this is how a patient resource would look like, okay? The first is resource type, patient. And where is my patient? Where did my patient go? Okay. This bar is coming on. All right. So if you see here, so identifier is 0 to star repeating. So if you see here, identifier, there is identifier and then it is a repeating one, right? And then if you see birth date, right, and gender, all those things are actually listed here, right? So you list it. So for example, let's take an example of name, for example, and then that will help you understand better. So for example, name, right? Name is 0 to star. What it means is name can be either absent or name can repeat multiple times, right? If you see here, the name actually is repeating multiple times, okay? The first time it's an official name, then the second time usual name, right? And then there is a maiden name also for the patient, right? So there are 3 different types of name that this person has been given, right? And this is just an example resource. You can choose to have just one, because in most of the cases, we will just have one name, right? But this is how you can support repeated names and repeated things, right? Similarly, we talked about telecom, right? We talked about telecom and we said telecom can be repeated, right? And you see the example here, telecom is repeated, right? 1 time, twice, thrice, like that, right? So that's how the resource will be. So the tool that I'm showing you is actually FHIR shorthand tool. And if we get time, I'll explain you this tool. But this tool actually helps you hand code a resource very easily, right? So for example, how to read, I'm just giving you a short example, right? So first, any of the terminology of the systems that you want, you just give a variable to that, right? So now you can reference this as the alias, right? Instance is actually the ID of the resource. So that will come on the top, right? Then instance of is actually the type of the resource, that is the patient. And then a usage example, you just leave it. And then actually start filling up the values like identifier.use. Now I'll talk to you about identifier.use and all. Where did this come from? So if you go here, you see identifier is a type identifier, right? So if you click on identifier, so identifier is a complex data type, okay? There are broadly two data types in FHIR. One is primitive data types and one is complex data types. Primitive data types are the data types which are like, can you give an example of primitive data types? It's Boolean is an example of a primitive data type. Or you can say integer is a primitive data type. So those are the primitive data types, right? And then there are complex data types, which are actually complex, right? Which are made up of more attributes and more elements, right? So FHIR has primitive data types and complex data types, right? And identifier is actually one of the complex data types. So identifier has attributes, use, type, system, value, period, and all, right? So that's why when you are defining, so you're putting identifier.use, identifier.type and all, right? So that's how it is. Now let's go in here and say, for example, marital status. This is the simple one, right? No, it's also a codable concept. We'll cover it later. So let's take a simple one, maybe. What is a simple one? So let's take an example of active itself, right? So if you have to put a resource and you're constructing a resource and where you have to put the attribute as active, okay? All you have to do is you just have to say, where is active?
Top.
Active equals true. So because it's already a type patient, right? You don't have to put everything. You just have to say active and true. And then it will actually translate into this, right? So what we have to do means we don't have to worry about the structure of the XML or the JSON, right? We write in the shorthand notation and it actually converts into a resource. Very powerful, but it's getting developed recently, but it's very useful for somebody who is actually trying to develop resources, right? And trying to hand code them just for understanding, right? You don't need anything. You just go to FSH online and you can play around with it. Okay. And we'll come back to this, but this is a resource that has been created. You take this resource, you go to the Postman, and we actually had created a patient that day. So you know how to create a patient. You just put the you have a post request. It's a type operation, so you put it on type patient. I just copied the resource that I created. I put it here, and I say send. It says unprocessable entity, means there is an error. So what is the error? The error is unknown resource ID organization 1. So what we might have done is we have given this organization as 1, right? So now you remember this is a reference. A reference means this resource should be existing on the server, right? Because it's a reference. We are referring to the particular resource that exists. In this particular server where we are posting, it does not know what organization 1 means, right? And that's why it is throwing that error. So what we can do is we can delete it and then create a new JSON. Okay, copy it, go here, Control A, Control V, and let's see, let's hope it works. It said 201 created. 201 created means it is actually, the resource was successfully created, and the resource path or the resource ID is here, right? So any questions on this resource creation piece? Because this we already covered in the last session. So no questions, I guess.
There is a question regarding difference between must support and required in FHIR.
There is a question between must support and required in FHIR.
Difference between.
Difference between. There is a nuanced difference to it. All right. Actually, we can take that in the conformance class, which is in the next session. But what happens is, let's take an example of okay, you saw how did I go to observation resource? We just typed observation. Okay. Saying observation, you have a status, and the status is 1-1, right? What 1-1 means is it is a required field, right? So whenever you are creating an observation resource, you actually have to give status. Okay, there is no way you can't give status in a observation resource. So that is what is required. Okay, whenever a resource, whenever an attribute has a value of 1, 1, and then 1, it means at least 1, means one time, right? You can also have 1 star, which means it is required to give you at least once, and you can give multiple times, right? So any attribute which has starting as 1 is a required attribute. Okay. Must support, on the other hand, is something that is good to support. It should be supported by the server, but the constraints are not that strict. So if you have that data, you should be supporting it. And it's more of an instruction material where it's saying that if this particular value comes for the client, for example, if this particular value comes, if this particular attribute comes, you should be honoring this and you should be supporting it. So you may not be required to send that value or process that value, but if the value comes, you should be supporting it. That's the fine difference between must support and required. When we go to the conformance class next time, we will actually dig deeper into what is must support, what is slicing, what is profiling, okay, in the next session. But for now, that's the difference. Required is something that is, you have already defined in the structured definition, and it has a cardinality of 1, ... and it could be 1 or star, which means that that attribute must be valued. I hope that answered the question.
Well, another question, does that mean we do not have any required attributes in patient resource?
That's can you not figure that out? So whoever asked that question, please figure that out and ping back the answer. Okay, that's a good question, but that's an exercise. You know how to read it now, right?
Language.
Just take a look at it and see. I don't see anything that is required here. Yeah, somebody said language, right? But
Yeah.
language is part of communication, so it's
Language is required.
But if you see, it's a hierarchy, right? So what happens in hierarchy, right? If the parent itself is not required, right? Then
If you are giving that language is.
So if you are putting communication for that particular patient, right? Then language must be given, right? But you can very well just rule out the entire communication itself, and we can test it out here also. So let's go see if there is communication here or not. I don't think communication is there, right? It's not there. So should we put that communication and then we can try it out, right? So let's see here. And so the syntax is communication, right? Communication. Control C does not work, huh? Copy. It does not work. So it's a lowercase or an uppercase? Lowercase. It's not typing at all. What happened? Communication. And then there was communication is 0 star, right?
Yes.
So we can say communication, and then there is a symbol called plus. Means add a new communication. Okay, and then you can say communication, and then you can say language, right? What happened again? I'm not getting it. Something is wrong with my keyboard. But you can try it out. I'll give you this code itself, right? So try it out, okay? Or we can do what is, we already have the JSON object, right? We can just put it in the JSON and see. But JSON is difficult to do. Okay. And what is the language? So if you go to here, what is the language? Language is coming from common languages. So we'll have to go here and see what is common languages. And if you go here, so I can put it AR. AR. Okay. What happened? I think this tool is hung. Okay, we'll see once it comes back again. So but we can try it out. Okay. Something is wrong in the tool, or maybe I'm not doing it right. Yes, something is wrong.
think you're missing the plus.
Mhm.
Plus sign.
Yeah.
Since there are two errors, that's the console. In the console at the bottom, it says two errors.
Name of null. I think something else is a problem. I think I missed it. So we'll take it after the session, right? We'll just see. Otherwise, we will lose the classes, right? So, but to answer the question in short, where did it go? So if the parent is absent, parent is optional, right? You don't need, means the entire block is optional, right? But if the parent is present, then the language needs to be there. Okay. So that's how to read it. All right. Any further questions before we go? Next.
There is a question to show once again successful addition of resource. Can you take that in the postman?
What's the question? It's already done, no? What is the question now? What's the question?
Yeah, there's a request to show once more the successful addition of resource.
It's done, right? So you see the 201 created, and that means that the resource has been created successfully. And this is the bundle that we just put in, right? Is there anything else to see?
If I submit this once again, it should throw an error, right?
No, it should not.
Another question. Are these FSH templates available somewhere, or do we need to create them?
FSH is not a template. It's actually a code that you can write. So actually you can just put a sample. So what I did was I just went in here. Okay, I went into examples. I took an example from here, and this time let's take another patient, right? So for example, let's take diseased patient, for example, right? I took the JSON for this guy. I copied this JSON and put it, and then I created a template from there. So you can actually take this and you can work on this also, right? So you don't have to actually go for FSH. You can actually, so these are valid JSONs that are there. So if you go to the the examples, these are all valid ones. You can start working with these yourself, right? I was just experimenting with FSH. Don't get confused. It's just a tool that makes life a little easier. Not at all mandatory part of the spec. Okay. Did I answer the question?
Yes.
Okay. One final question, then we can go back to our sessions because a lot of things are pending. We just got digressed a little bit.
Yes, there is a question regarding the ID. It says ID got auto-generated, but we didn't see any attribute related with it in patient entity.
Can you repeat again the question?
Okay. ID got auto-generated, but we didn't see any attribute related with it in patient entity.
That's a good question. That's a good question. That's a good question. Let's see that. So, and that we have to come to it now. So, and that will be answered in our presentation. So just keep that question in hold for a few more minutes. Any other questions? ID question we'll answer. What else?
No, you can proceed with the presentation.
Okay. All right. So I'll go back to the presentation. Okay. So I hope this walkthrough of the resources and walkthrough of how to actually read a resource was helpful. Now it gives you a little bit of confidence that if there is a resource, you will figure out what it means, right? Okay, next. Am I in the slide share mode? Like slideshow mode?
No.
Is there
Yes.
a relation?
Yeah.
Just a minute. Okay. So this is the question that you had right now, right? So how do the resource definitions work, right? So all resources, right, have uh, uh, an identity, a metadata, a base language, and a reference to implicit rules. Okay. So that's at the resource level. Okay. So every resource that is defined actually has an ID, metadata, implicit rules, and language defined for it. Keep that in mind. Then what happens is resources are actually, they can be extended, right? Or they can be inherited, right? So a domain resource is a resource that actually builds on top of the resource itself. So this is a resource, the base resource. On that, there is a domain resource. So what domain resource does is it inherits all the properties that resource has, plus it adds a few more resources, a few more attributes of its own, right? So a domain resource, in addition to identity, means the ID, metadata, language, and implicit rules, has three more things: a narrative section, or the narrative, a content resource if it required, and then extensions. Okay, so the base resource does not, you don't see extension in here, but a domain resource has actually an attribute where you can actually extend it. You can add extensions to base resource. So that's a domain resource. So domain resource is actually an abstract resource. What it means is domain resource in itself does not exist. So domain resource needs to be their descendants needs to work, right? For example, patient is a domain resource. Encounter is a domain resource. Everything that we saw was actually a domain resource, right? So that's why you did not see directly the ID, because ID is the part of the inheritance, right? So that's why you did not see directly the ID piece of it. Okay. So typically all the resources that are there in FHIR, except for few, actually inherit from domain resource, which in turn inherits from resource, right? Exceptions are bundle, parameter, and binary resources, which are actually direct descendants of a resource. Now, if I go back to the resource here, and this will explain you, you see here the patient domain resource, elements defined in the ancestor. You see this? So these are the elements or attributes that are coming from the ancestors itself. If you click on domain resource, you actually see the things that we talked about. It has a text, that is a narrative, the contained, and the extension. Okay, and it actually inherits, it is a type of a resource, and the ancestors are ID, metadata, implicit rules, and language. So if you click on a resource, you actually see ID, meta, implicit rules, and language. Got it? So that's how the ID, even though we did not put it, it was there, part of the resource definition, right? And when you do the post, right, when you do a create of a resource, right, you don't tell the server that I need this ID, right? Generally, the server decides what ID should that particular instance of resource get. And that's why IDs are given by the server. So when you get a response, you get the ID. And if you had attended the last session, we also had actually conditional create and conditional create, for example, or upsert also we had, right? So these two scenarios where you can actually provide an ID for the server. And if that does not exist, the server can create a resource on that particular ID. So that's that we covered in the last session. Okay. So now coming to the resource guide. So now there is a question that comes very often, and that's a practical question, is like, if I have a use case, if I have a business case, right? How do I know what resources to apply? How do you know what resources to choose, right? So there is actually a resource guide page that is given in the spec, which talks about the clinical concept. For example, if you're using a laboratory result, then what are the resources, or where you should be finding the matching resource for it. So here is the blown up example, right? For example, if you are doing a vital signs, and the example is, vital signs example is temperature, body pressure, heart rate, respiratory rate, anything, right? You may look at observation, right? Similarly, if you are going to work with allergies, what happened? Similarly, if you're going to work with allergies, you can use the allergy intolerance resource. And if you're using clinical diagnosis, for example, giving some kind of diagnosis, you can use the condition. So this, again, the guidelines are given in the spec itself. And this is the URL for it, hl7.org/FHIR resource guide.html. You go there and actually you will find some guidelines. Okay, so we did talk about references between resources, and we said like the references are important because resources interact with each other, or resources actually refer each other, right? And this is a typical, I'm just giving you an example. For example, if you have a patient, right, and an allergy, right? So allergy, the subject is patient, okay? Means allergies, for whom the allergy are recording, that's the patient, right? That's why there should be a reference in allergy for the patient, right? And you see the same thing, allergy, somebody is recording that allergy, right? Who is recording it? The practitioner. So again, there is a reference to the practitioner, right? That's how it is, right? So references make sense in that particular way, where you are actually want to convey information that is not exactly contained in that particular resource. But you know, other resource can actually fulfill that, right? So you just have to reference that, right? So that's where references are very valuable. Okay, and then few rules about references that you should keep in mind. References can be relative or absolute. Relative reference, for example, is like you just give the resource type and then the ID. Right? Or the resource references can be like you can put the full URL of the reference. Both are valid ways. Okay. So there is a question that always comes is like, should references be on the same server, right? Absolutely not. References can reside in two different or multiple servers, right? As long as they are resolvable, they are good. Right. So for example, you can have a demographic server, you can have a clinical server, and they can work together. Right. The third point is servers do not have to enforce integrity. If something is broken, the server will just give you the error, like we saw, right? That this resource does not exist, or I'm not able to resolve the reference. It's not server's responsibility to actually enforce the integrity, right? And it's the client who need to actually give the server the right URLs in their request, so that the server can act on it. Okay. So just keep that in mind when we are working with the references, that references are very flexible, but it's mostly the client's responsibility to make sure that when they're giving the request to the server, the references are proper. Okay. Now there is a concept of contained resources. So what happens? So, and this is happening mostly in HL7 version 2 to FHIR world. When we are doing the conversion of HL7 version 2 to FHIR, right? There are certain information which, like for example, in OBR or in PV1 segment, you get the information about the doctor, right? But the information is only the doctor's name and the ID, right? That is not sufficient to actually create a new resource, right? But that information is important, right, for that particular HL7 message. how do you convey that information in FHIR, right? So for that and similar use cases, there are contained resources. So in contained resources, what happens is instead of referring something outside, you can actually put that particular piece of information inside your resource itself, right? With a contained tag. We can see that example. You just go to that references page and you can see the example of contained resources. Contained resources are very powerful, right? In certain scenarios where you want to put everything in one packet. Okay, data types we already covered. There are two types of data types broadly. Means actually there are four, but two are more important: primitive data types and complex data types. And then this is the listing of all the data types that FHIR has. And these are the complex data types. Complex data types are made up of one or more other data types, which may be complex or which may be primitive, right? So that's how the complex data types get made, right? And some examples of complex data types are, which you should be familiar with, is like human name, right? For example, name itself is a complex data type because it's not just a string. A name consists of last name, first name, given name, suffix, prefix, and all those things. Like even the type of the name, right? Is it the usual name, use of the usual name, or given name, or the official name, or whatever it is, right? So keep in mind, when you are dealing with resources, you are either dealing with primitive data types or you are dealing with complex data types. Okay. What we saw, and no one asked that question, so I did not answer also. When we were looking at the resources, right? We saw on the left-hand side, there are a lot of icons, right? There was a folder icon, there was a question mark icon, there were stars, and all those icons, right? Those icons have special meanings when you are reading the spec, right? Go back and look at those icons and see whether you can make sense of them, right? So those icons are important when you are reading a spec. So I have listed them here, but you can just go and look at them again. Okay, and we already covered the flags. So we covered some of the flags, like we covered the summary flag, we covered the modifier flag, but there are other flags also that you can look at, right? Okay, do we have time for this exercise? It's 5:27. If you guys are still on, we can do an exercise.
There's a question, Satyam. Shall we take it or
yes,
after the exercise?
Yeah, please.
Okay. If I want to assign a hospital-specific ID to a patient, how do I do that? Provide it in the identifier attribute?
Yes, that's the right one. Because see, ID, right? The ID attribute is actually the server's internal. You can just say, in database terms, it's the row num, right? So generally, you don't decide the row num, right? It's the database server which decides, right? What you decide is what will be the MRN of that patient, or what will be the social security number or the PAN card or some hospital ID of that patient, right? So that's the differentiation between ID and the identifier. Identifier is something which is related to the business. Maybe the hospital ID is also the identifier. So you're right.
Another question regarding cardinality. Don't we get the need to have star dot star type cardinality?
One star would be good enough, right? Why will you have star dot star, right? So 0 to star is actually star to star, right? Just think about it, right? What would star to star mean? Right? So I think 0 to star suffix means is actually equivalent to star, if you can think of, right?
So will give us to have we can put it as a null, like in star data, like we can have like many to many type relationship if we talk about in reference terms.
So I see cardinality is about that particular attribute or element repeating, right, or existing, right? So you don't need relationships there, right? Either that attribute is optional, required, and optional and repeating, required and repeating, right? These are the only things available, right? It's not relationship, right? It's more about that particular attribute that we are talking about, right? It can be present or it can be absent. If it is present, it can be present n number of times, or it may not be present, right? Or it may be present only 2 number of times, right? So that's what the cardinality is, right? So it's not relationship. It's about that particular attribute, whether it is present or not, right?
Yes, sir.
Regarding this identifier, like the example we saw, the same identifier it got recreated. The same identifier when we submitted, it got created. That means internally a second ID was generated.
Yes. If you see the ID, right, when the server sent you, right, it will send you a different.
Yeah, but if the identifier needs to be some hospital MRN, and in the same way, if we are sending, it will duplicate it, right? So
there you will do a conditional. No, so you can do a conditional create in that case. So I don't know. Maybe we covered it last time, right? So what happens is you can actually provide a condition on which the create should happen. If does not exist, then create.
Okay.
Right? And then in that condition, you can provide the ID as a search parameter, right? So what the server will do is first look for that ID. If that ID is not there, then it will create. Otherwise, it will just return you the same resource.
So that validation logic needs to be on the server, right?
Yes, conditional create servers do support.
Okay.
Otherwise, you will be infinitely creating resources, right? Okay.
So, Satyam, I have a question with respect to maturity.
Okay.
So, if we have 2 different servers, let's say 2 different insurance companies supporting 2 different levels of maturity. So, as client or as a clinic, if we want to submit claims or something of that sort, if you want to post something, as client, should I support both of them and then post the resources? And wouldn't it become clumsy on our side if we have keep increasing?
I did not get your question.
So if we have 2 different entities, let's say 2 different insurance companies, okay? One insurance company is supporting a resource, which is at maturity level of 2.
Okay.
And another insurance company is supporting the same resource, which is at maturity level of 3. Maybe it could have developed recently.
So you are saying 2 different versions of FHIR?
Yes.
Okay. So it again depends on your capability statement. So when you are putting the capability statement of your client, right? In that you can specify what versions do you support.
Okay, but eventually we have to support both of them, right?
It depends on your business case, right? You can say that I don't support this, right? But again, it's the flexibility on the implementer, right? There is no rule of thumb, right? It depends on the business case.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
Maximum you can do is you can give in the capability statement saying that I do support both or I support just one, right?
Okay. Okay. Yeah.
I think during the transition period, you may have to support both.
Yeah. So that's what I was saying. It could become a little clumsy to support all the level of resources if you have multiple entities. But yeah, as you said, during transition, yes, we might have to.
So in interest of time, shall we go with the exercise and all?
Yeah, sure. Satyam.
Okay. All right. So this is the exercise, and everyone, you can have your pen and paper ready. And what we need to do is, so this is a recording of a consultation. Okay. So the exercise is, you have a 12-year-old boy whose first consultation with Dr. Smith, the complaint was, and this may not be clinically right. So clinicians, if you are there on the call, please excuse me, right? So this is just a mock-up example, right? So clinicians, please excuse, right? So on the clinical validity of this example, but the idea is to find out what are the applicable resources that would be needed for recording this type of a consultation, okay? So there is a 12-year-old boy, his first consultation was with Dr. Smith, and the complaint was of pain in the right ear for 3 days with elevated temperature. And the temperature recording is given there. there is a diagnosis, and there is a prescription also. And then there is a follow-up, right? So take 2 minutes, write down the resources that you think will be applicable, right? And then when we see the results, just match how close or how far you are, right? And that's all it is. You need not name the resources exactly right, because you don't know all the resource names by heart. But how many resources will be required and what will be the type of resource or the name of the resource? That should be good enough. Understood the exercise? Okay, so 12-year-old boy means we are talking about patient demographics, right? So there should be a patient resource for sure, right? That's the hint that I gave you. Now, other resources, just go with it.
Do you want the participants to type in the resources? Because
no, just keep it with you.
They are typing it.
No, just keep with you. And when we just flash the results, just see how many of those you got it right and how many, I think, were off. That's it. All right, so what I'll do is, it's 5:36, 1 more minute, and then we will look at the resources.
We have a few questions unanswered. Can we take them after the exercise?
Yes, once we close the slides,
okay.
Just give us a few more minutes.
So answer has to be typed in, correct?
No, just keep it with yourself.
Okay.
Okay, so it's 5:37, and so these are the resources that I could figure out that might be required. Okay. So you need a practitioner resource because you have Dr. Smith. You need a patient resource because you have a 12-year-old boy, demographics. Consultation, follow-up consultation, that would go in encounter, right? And the pain in the right ear for 3 days and then itchy skin, breathing difficulties, they can all go in condition. Observation would be like his temperature and the rash or even the inflamed right eardrum, those can go in observations. Medications is clear, like whatever the medicines he's taking can go in medication, and allergy can go in allergy. The penicillin allergy can go in allergy intolerance. So it was quite a straightforward thing. And this is an exercise that we used to do in HL7V2 world also, right? So similar exercise. And so if you got everything right, good. If not, just see like what did not go well, and nothing to worry about because you are new to the resources, but just to give you a mapping experience that I just did this. Okay. And this is about relationships that we can cover later, but this is more about looking at the encounter resource and like just seeing like how does it go, right? This is the first encounter. This is the second encounter. There is a patient and there is a practitioner, there is an asserter. So those kind of things, but for now, let's leave it. Okay. So now I will leave you with a couple of things, and this will be an exercise that you should be doing as a prep for next session. So look at clinfhir. Okay, clinfhir is open source, publicly available FHIR client. It was actually designed to support clinicians in FHIR events, but it has actually now become a very good tool in visualizing the resources, right? So take a look at clinfhir, and if you guys stay back, I will show what the clinfhir is. And then I actually showed you this FSH. So again, FSH, you can just go and try it out. It's still in development. It's not very robust, but something which is looks promising, which simplifies creation of resources or creation of implementation guides. Like it makes things simpler. All right. So we will come to clinfhir, but before that, note down this assignment for next session. If you do this assignment, your next session will be easy. You will understand a lot. It will give you value for time. Okay. So read the blog post. This was accessing lab data via FHIR part 1. It is actually 3-part or 4-part series. Just read that blog post. It actually talks about a scenario. It talks about how to construct resources, how to construct terminology services, codes, values, concept maps, everything. And then try to replicate the use case yourself by following the blog as much as possible. Okay. If you do that and you come back next time, you will be like, you will gain a lot in the next session. So with that, what I'll do is I'll go back to clinfhir and show you what I wanted to show in clinfhir. Just a minute. Let me see if clinfhir is open. Okay. So this is clinfhir. Okay. So in clinfhir, I was looking at graph builder. Okay. So what does the graph builder do? And this was a question that somebody asked in one of the sessions, was if I have a series of resources, right? Sequence of resources, and I just want to know like how they are interrelated, and can there be a visual depiction of that, right? So actually, you can go to the graph builder, you can create your resources, and you can actually link them together and see like how they are related. So what happens is, so for example, let's add a new resource. Okay. So let's add a new resource, allergy. Okay. And say, this is just a name, I just keep it. Okay. Now, if you go here, right now, in the graph, I don't see allergy anywhere, right? Do I see? I don't see. Okay. And then I see the contents. I see food allergy. Okay. So now what we'll do is we'll go to allergy resource and see what all references are possible. So see, this is the good thing if you want to learn about the resource also, right? If you're putting allergy intolerance can have reference to encounter, okay, can have reference to practitioner, patient, right? And in different attributes, right? So for example, allergy can be recorded as part of an encounter. Allergy can be recorded by a practitioner who acts as a recorder, okay? Patient can also be a recorder, right? Practitioner can be an asserter. Asserter means, yeah, I say that this person has this allergy, right? So these are the references possible. So now if we go to the resource also, and let's see. If you see, so the first reference that we had was, where did it go? Allergy encounter, right? So if you go here, and if you see encounter has a reference, patient has a reference, and if you see recorder, who recorded this allergy, right? So you can have a practitioner or a patient or related person, anyone who can say that this person has this allergy, right? Asserter is who told you this about this information, right? That is an asserter, right? And again, either a patient can tell you that, or a doctor can tell you that, or a related person can tell you that, right? So these are the references. So what this graph builder does is actually shows you the references very well, right? And then if you put those references in sequence, and then you go to the graph, actually you will see that particular linkage happening. So you had the food allergy, and now it is linked to the encounter, it is linked to the practitioner, and it is linked to the patient, right? So this is a way of visualizing resources, right? If you want. So that's what, so if you're building a scenario, if you are trying to work out a certain use case, right? You can use clinfhir and see like how your use case is shaping up, right? You can actually go and look at the resource definitions. What are the resources, right? For each resource, if you click on encounter, it shows like what are the resources and all these things, right? And it gives you the details of it. And then you can actually, if you know FSH, you can actually put in the values in there, and you can actually generate a bundle which you can actually post on a FHIR server. All those things you can do, right? So this is one that I wanted you to experiment with, the graph builder. So just take a resource, try to build out a scenario and see how the relationships are, okay? Then the other thing that I wanted to see was, suppose you get a bundle. You all know what is a bundle. A bundle is a collection of resources, right? So in a bundle, there are multiple resources coming together. So if you want to do a batch operation or a transaction operation or a document kind of an operation, right? We record a documentation, right? Discharge summary, right? So actually it's a collection of multiple resources, right? And that collection actually goes in bundle, okay? So I just looked at a bundle and tried to figure out what are the resources in that bundle, and this is a sample resource that I got, bundle that I got from the internet. So that has so many, that bundle has a patient, organization, practitioner, multiple encounters, condition, claim, and so many things, right? I was just looking at how does it look in the graph. It looks like this. And then you can click on every resource and see like what resource it is and how does it work. So, and also if you have a bundle and you want to visualize that, what is the relationships within that bundle, you can actually upload a what do you say, a bundle and look at it. So you can do that, okay? So that's the bundle visualizer, that's a graph. And then the last one is, if you want to actually do and try, is the scenario builder. What you can do here is actually you can build a scenario, just like we were talking about that visualizer, right? Graph builder. This is a scenario builder. And remember, we created this patient last time, right? FHIR FN. So I was trying to create a lab test for a diagnostic report and trying to create a scenario. And then here, what I did was I just wanted to see the graph, how it looks. So since I had 2 resources only, the graph looks like this. But if we start adding more resources, it will start looking different. So let's add a resource encounter. Oh, the happy server. So for this particular patient, there is no encounter, so it's not possible. But you get my point. So this is a visual representation of the resources that you want to see, right? So clinfhir is a handy tool if you are new to the resources, or if you want to build a scenario, if you want to work out a requirement, right? Those things, I think clinfhir suits very well. You can actually send resources to a FHIR server, pull it from there, all those things you can do. And it's open source, so that's not a problem. So take a look at clinfhir. But actually, this is the thing that you need to do for the next session.